The bells don't ring for strangers, someone would later say. But that morning, they started long before anyone knew why. Long before the dust trail reached the edge of town. Long before a single pair of eyes laid sight on the man who had already given everything he had left somewhere out in that empty stretch of desert where heat rises in waves and silence feels heavier than any burden a man can carry. 12 hours earlier, the sun had been high and merciless, pressing down on the land like a hand that never lifts. And Ethan Cole had been riding alone, the steady rhythm of his horse the only sound for miles, when he spotted something unnatural against the pale sand, a shape that didn't belong, half buried by wind and time, still enough to make a man wonder if he was seeing things. He dismounted slow, boots crunching against dry earth, one hand resting near his belt not out of fear but habit, and as he stepped closer, the shape resolved into a man, older, dressed in worn black cloth, collar still white beneath the dust, a preacher by the look of him, breathing shallow, barely holding on. Ethan crouched beside him, eyes scanning the horizon first, always the horizon, because nothing in this land happens without leaving a trace. And sure enough, there were marks in the sand that didn't match the preacher's boots, tracks that circled, paused, then moved on, as if whoever made them had chosen to leave rather than finish something. The preacher's hand twitched, fingers brushing weakly against Ethan's sleeve, lips parting just enough to let a whisper escape. Something about water, something about time running out, and Ethan didn't ask questions. Not yet, because out here, questions could wait, but death didn't. He lifted the man carefully, feeling the weight settle across his shoulders, heavier than it should have been for someone so close to the edge, and when he stood, the sun hit him full in the face, hot and blinding, like the desert itself was testing whether he meant to follow through. He looked back once, just once, at the direction he'd come from, at the path that would lead him back to shade, to safety, to a canteen that wasn't already half empty, and then he turned toward town instead, toward a place still 10 miles out, where the ground shimmered and the air moved like it had a mind of its own. Every step after that felt longer than the last, sand pulling at his boots, heat pressing into his skin, the preacher shifting slightly with each movement, breath coming and going like a weak tide. And somewhere along that long stretch of nothing, Ethan started to notice something else, the feeling of being watched. Not close enough to hear, not close enough to see clearly, but there in the distance, shapes that didn't belong to the wind or the rocks, moving when he moved, stopping when he stopped. He didn't reach for his gun, didn't call out, because whatever they weren't making a move yet, and that meant something. Meant they were waiting, judging, reading the story from afar the same way any man would. One man carrying another across open land, no witnesses, no explanation, just dust and distance and a version of the truth that could look like anything depending on who was watching. The preacher stirred again, a low sound escaping his throat, and Ethan adjusted his grip, shifting the weight, feeling his own strength already beginning to drain faster than it should, faster than it had any right to this early in the day. But he kept walking, one step, then another, because turning back now would mean leaving the man to the sun, and leaving him would be easier, sure, but it would also be something Ethan knew he wouldn't walk. Away from clean. Behind him, far off on the ridge, one of the distant shapes stopped moving entirely, horse and rider blending into the line where sky meets earth, watching as the lone cowboy carried his burden deeper into a land that had already decided how most stories like this were supposed to end by the time the sun began its slow descent. The heat had not eased. It had only changed, turning sharper, drier, pulling moisture from the air and from a man's lungs with every breath, and Ethan Cole could feel it working against him now, not just pressing from above, but rising from the ground beneath his boots, seeping through leather, climbing into his bones, making each step feel heavier than the last. The preacher's weight had settled deeper across his shoulders, no longer shifting, no longer helping in even the smallest way, and that stillness carried its own kind of warning, the kind that made a man listen closer than he wanted to. Ethan adjusted his grip again, one hand steadying the man's back, the other holding what remained of his canteen, now light enough to tell its own story without being opened. And he knew he had to choose soon, not between right and wrong, but between how long he could keep going and how much he was willing to give up to do it. The horizon shimmered ahead, the town still miles out. Buildings not yet visible but imagined, remembered from a distance measured too many times before, and behind him, those shapes he had felt earlier had not disappeared. They had only grown clearer in the corners of his vision. Riders moving along the ridge lines, never closing the distance, never calling out, just watching, measuring, deciding. One of them shifted position, a silhouette against the fading light, and Ethan slowed without meaning to, not out of fear, but because something about their patience said more than any threat could, said that whatever judgment they were making had not yet been settled. The preacher stirred then, just enough to remind Ethan that he was still there, still holding on to something thin and fading, and a breath slipped from his lips, a word half-formed, something about a valley, about people who would not listen, and Ethan leaned his head just slightly, trying to catch it, but the wind took the sound before it could become meaning. He kept walking, because stopping too long would make starting again harder, and because the ground here had a way of convincing a man to stay where he fell, and he was not ready to let that happen, not yet. As the sun dipped lower, the light stretched long across the desert, turning every rock and shadow into something that could be mistaken for movement, and for a moment, Ethan thought he had lost them, those distant riders, until one appeared again, closer this time, not hidden, not cautious, simply there, horse standing still as if carved from the land itself. Ethan did not reach for his weapon, did not speak, just met the distance with the same silence, because words out here could travel in the wrong direction, could turn something uncertain into something final. The rider watched, head tilted slightly, taking in the sight of a man carrying another man across a land that offered no easy explanations. And then, just as quietly as he had appeared, he turned his horse and moved along the ridge, not leaving, just repositioning, like a piece on a board that had not yet revealed its purpose. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and kept moving, one step after another, the rhythm becoming the only thing that mattered, the only thing keeping him from thinking too far ahead, because thinking ahead meant counting the miles, and counting the miles meant admitting how little strength he had left to finish them. The sky shifted toward dusk, colors bleeding into each other, the heat finally loosening its grip just enough to be replaced by a creeping cold that would come faster than a man expected, and Ethan knew that once the temperature dropped, the preacher's chances would fall with it, because a body that weak could not fight both the heat of the day and the cold of the night. He paused just long enough to tilt the canteen, letting a single mouthful of water fall against the preacher's lips, watching as it barely registered, a small movement, a faint swallow, but still a sign that something remained, and that was enough for Ethan to keep going. Behind him, the riders had spread out now, no longer a single presence, but several, forming a loose arc that mirrored his path without crossing it, and whatever they believed they were seeing, they were not rushing to act on it, not yet, and that waiting carried a weight heavier than any immediate danger, because it meant the moment of decision was still coming, just not on Ethan's terms. The first star appeared above the horizon, faint against the fading light, and Ethan lifted his eyes to it for just a second, not as a prayer, not as a hope, but as a marker, something steady in a world that had begun to blur at the edges, and then he lowered his gaze again and took another step forward, into the cooling air, into the lengthening shadows, carrying a man whose story he did not know, toward a town that might not understand why he had chosen not to leave him behind. The night did not arrive gently. It came fast and certain, pulling the last heat from the ground and replacing it with a cold that moved through cloth and skin without asking permission. And Ethan Cole felt it the moment the sun disappeared, a sharp drop that made his muscles tighten and his breath show faint in the air, each step now carrying not just weight but resistance from a body that had already given more than it should. The preacher hung heavier against him, not because his weight had changed, but because Ethan's strength had, and the difference between the two was becoming harder to ignore with every yard of ground left behind. The desert had grown quiet in a different way now, not the empty silence of midday, but something watchful, something that listened back, and somewhere out there, beyond what his eyes could clearly see, those riders were still there, no longer just shadows on the edge of sight. but a presence that moved with intention, circling wider, tightening, slower, as if they were waiting for something specific to happen before stepping in. Ethan stopped for a moment, just long enough to shift the preacher's weight and steady his own balance, his knees threatening to give without warning, and he lowered the man carefully to the ground, not letting him fall, not letting him feel the roughness of the earth more than he had to. And for the first time since he had started walking, Ethan allowed himself to fully look at him, to take in the lines of his face beneath the dust, the age in his skin, the faint movement of breath that still came and went like something borrowed rather than owned. The preacher's eyes fluttered open then, not fully, not with strength, but enough to find Ethan's face in the dim light. And for a second there was something there, recognition or maybe just relief, and his lips moved again, slower this time, clearer. "You should have left me." The words barely carried, more felt than heard, and Ethan shook his head once. Small, certain, like the answer had already been decided hours ago and did not need to be spoken out loud. He reached for the canteen again, tipped it carefully, letting the last of the water touch the preacher's lips, watching as the man tried to swallow, tried to hold on to something so small it should not have mattered. And when the canteen emptied completely, Ethan did not throw it aside. He capped it and set it down next to them. Like even an empty thing still deserved its place, a sound came. Then, not loud, not sudden, but enough to shift the air between them. The soft movement of hooves against sand, closer now, no longer distant, and Ethan did not turn right away, did not reach for anything. He simply stood, slowly, feeling the stiffness in his legs, the strain in his back, and then he turned to face them. 3 riders stood within a distance that no longer allowed misunderstanding to hide behind space. Their figures outlined against the faint starlight, their posture steady, unreadable, and for a moment no one moved. No one spoke, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any words could. One of them nudged his horse forward a few steps, not aggressive, not hesitant, just enough to close the gap between observation and presence, and his eyes moved from Ethan to the preacher on the ground, taking in the scene not as it might appear from afar, but as it was now, up close, undeniable. Ethan lifted his hands slightly, not in surrender, not in defense, just open, empty, a gesture that said there was nothing to hide, nothing to reach for, and he stepped back once, creating space between himself and the man he had carried, as if to show that whatever judgment was coming, it would not be made under confusion. The rider studied him for a long second, then another, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, not fully understood, but changed enough to alter the air around them. And behind him, the other 2 riders adjusted their positions, no longer circling, no longer closing, just waiting. The preacher stirred again, a faint sound escaping him, and the rider's gaze dropped once more, lingering this time, as if searching for something beyond what was visible, something that required more than a glance to recognize. And Ethan stood there in the cold, hands still open, breathing steady despite everything in him wanting to rest, because whatever came next would not be decided by strength alone. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion, he understood that this moment, quiet as it was, carried more weight than the miles he had already walked. The cold settled deeper as the night stretched on, not sudden but steady, like something patient enough to wait a man out. And Ethan Cole could feel it working through his boots, up his legs, into his spine, a slow reminder that time was no longer something he had plenty of. The 3 riders remained where they were, not closing in, not backing away, their horses calm beneath them, as if this moment required stillness more than action. And the man in front finally spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying just enough to reach without needing to rise, asking a simple question that held more weight than it sounded. "Why do you carry him?" And the words hung there between them, not demanding, not accusing, but waiting. Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have one, but because out here, answers were not something you rushed, and he glanced once at the preacher lying on the ground, the faint rise and fall of his chest barely visible in the dim light, before looking back at the rider and saying, quiet and plain, "Because he is not done yet." And nothing more followed, no explanation, no defense, just the kind of truth that either stood on its own or fell apart under the weight of doubt. The rider studied him again, longer this time, eyes narrowing slightly as if measuring not just the words but the space between them, and behind him. The other two shifted just enough to signal they were listening, not deciding yet, but close. The wind moved across the open land, carrying the dry scent of dust and sage, brushing against them all the same. And for a moment, it felt like the desert itself had gone still, waiting for something to break the quiet. The preacher stirred again, a faint breath catching, and his hand moved weakly against the ground, fingers searching. Without strength, and the rider's gaze followed that motion, dropping from Ethan to the man he had carried, taking in the worn cloth, the collar, the signs that marked him not as a threat, but as something else entirely, something that did not belong in a place like this unless there was a reason. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the fatigue in his body no longer something he could hide even if he tried, his shoulders heavy, his stance not quite steady, but he did not step back, did not lower his gaze, because whatever this moment was, it was not one he intended to walk away from by accident. The rider dismounted then, slow and deliberate, boots touching the ground with a soft sound that carried farther than it should have, and he walked forward a few steps, closing the distance enough to see clearly, enough to remove any doubt that might still have lingered from afar. He crouched beside the preacher, not touching him, not yet, just observing, eyes tracing the lines of a man who had come too far to be left where he lay. And then he looked up at Ethan again, something different in his expression now, not trust, not fully, but something closer to understanding. Behind him, one of the other riders reached into a pouch and withdrew a small skin of water, holding it loosely, waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. And Ethan saw it, saw the movement, but did not speak, did not ask, because asking would change the balance of what was happening here, and he had already chosen to stand without bargaining. The rider on the ground placed his hand lightly against the preacher's shoulder, feeling for something that could not be seen, and when he withdrew it, he stood again, turning his head slightly toward the others, a small motion that carried meaning without words, and the man with the water skin stepped forward, extending it not to the preacher, but to Ethan. The gesture was simple, but it held a shift in it, a quiet change from watching to acting, from judgment to something else. And Ethan hesitated for the briefest moment, not out of distrust, but because he understood what accepting it meant, that whatever line had been drawn between them had just been crossed in a way that could not be undone. He took the skin carefully, nodding once, a silent acknowledgement, and knelt beside the preacher again, lifting his head just enough to let a small amount of water touch his lips. And this time, the response was stronger, a clearer swallow, a breath that held a fraction more life than before. The rider watched this closely, eyes fixed on the exchange, and when Ethan lowered the man back to the ground, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried less distance, less suspicion, and more of something unspoken that had begun to take shape between them. Far off in the distance, the faint outline of the land shifted as the first hint of moonlight rose higher, casting a pale glow across the desert. And for the first time since Ethan had begun his journey, he was no longer alone in the weight of what he carried, even if no one had said so out loud. The water changed everything, not because it was much, but because it was enough, and in a place where enough was rare, that alone carried weight. Ethan Cole felt at the moment the preacher's breathing steadied just a fraction, not strong, not safe, but no longer slipping as quickly as before, and that small shift pulled something in Ethan back from the edge as well, something he had not realized was already starting to give. He sat back on his heels for a second, just long enough to feel the ache in his legs, the burn in his shoulders where the man's weight had pressed for miles. And then he looked up again at the rider who had offered the water, studying him now not as a distant figure on a ridge, but as a man standing within arm's reach, someone who had made a choice just as deliberate as Ethan's had been hours earlier. The rider said nothing, but his gaze moved once more between Ethan and the preacher, as if confirming something that had already begun to settle in his mind. And then he turned slightly, speaking a few quiet words to the others in a language that carried low and steady, not meant for explanation but for understanding. The other two nodded once, their posture shifting in a way that spoke of agreement without needing to show it. And then one of them stepped closer, his horse moving with him, calm and unhurried. as if the night itself had given permission for this moment to change. Ethan remained still, not rising, not stepping back, simply watching as the man approached, because out here, movement mattered, and the wrong one could turn something fragile into something broken. The rider stopped a few feet away and gestured toward the preacher, then toward Ethan, a simple motion that asked a question without forming it, and Ethan understood it for what it was, an offer, not of control, but of help. He shook his head once at first, not in refusal, but in instinct, the kind that comes from carrying something alone for too long to let it go easily. And for a second the air tightened again, the balance shifting on something unspoken, until Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded once instead. The smallest change that carried the weight of acceptance. The rider moved then, not rushing, not imposing, but stepping in just enough to take part of the burden, adjusting his position so that when Ethan lifted the preacher again, the weight did not fall entirely on his shoulders this time. It was not much, just a redistribution, a sharing that turned one man's struggle into something held by more than one set of hands, and Ethan felt the difference immediately, the strain easing just enough to remind him how close he had been to losing it entirely. Together, they began to move, not fast, not with urgency that would break what had just been formed, but steady, deliberate, each step placed with care, the riders now no longer circling but walking alongside, their presence no longer distant or uncertain, but part of the path itself. The night stretched around them, stars growing brighter overhead, the desert cooling further with each passing minute, and somewhere ahead, still unseen but no longer unreachable, lay the town that had set all of this into motion. The preacher stirred again as they walked, his voice still weak but clearer now, and this time the words held shape. They would not listen, he murmured, and Ethan glanced down, not asking who or why, because some things revealed themselves in their own time, and pushing for them too soon only drove them further away. One of the riders heard it as well, his head turning slightly, attention sharpening, and for a moment there was something like recognition in his expression, something tied to a story that had not yet been spoken out loud. The group continued forward, the rhythm of their movement settling into something shared, something balanced, and the land around them seemed to open just a little, as if the distance ahead had shortened by a measure no map could explain. Behind them, the path they had taken faded quickly into the dark, erased by wind and time, leaving no clear trace of where they had come from. Only the quiet understanding that what had happened back there could not be undone, and what lay ahead would carry it forward whether any of them spoke of it or not. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his breath steady now despite the fatigue that still clung to him. And for the first time since he had lifted the preacher from the sand, he was no longer walking toward something alone, even if no one said it, even if no one needed to, because out here, the things that mattered most were rarely spoken, and when they were, they did not carry half the weight of what could be understood in silence. The rhythm of their movement settled into something quieter now, not easier, but steadier, like a balance had been found between effort and purpose, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way his steps no longer dragged against the ground but followed it, guided by more than just will. The man beside him carried part of the weight without speaking, adjusting when Ethan shifted, matching his pace without needing direction, and behind them the other two riders moved in a loose line, not guarding, not pressing, simply there, a presence that filled the empty space the desert had held before. The preacher's breathing grew more consistent, still shallow but no longer slipping away, and every few minutes a faint sound escaped him, fragments of thought that seemed to rise and fall with the motion, words that belonged to something beyond the night around them. They came at dusk, he murmured once, barely louder than the wind, and Ethan did not look down this time, did not interrupt, because the man's voice carried a thread that might unravel if pulled too soon. The rider at Ethan's side heard it as well, his head turning slightly, listening not just to the words but to what lay beneath them, and for a moment his expression tightened, not in anger, but in recognition of something that had already been understood before it was spoken. The land ahead shifted slowly as they moved, the flat stretch giving way to low ridges that broke the horizon into uneven lines, and the air grew colder still, each breath visible now, each exhale a reminder of how much warmth had already been lost. Ethan's hands had begun to stiffen, fingers tightening around the fabric of the preacher's coat, and he flexed them once, twice, trying to keep the feeling in them, because losing that would mean losing control, and control was the one thing he could not afford to let slip. They paused briefly at the base of a shallow rise, not to rest, but to adjust, to take stock of what remained in them, and one of the riders behind stepped forward, offering a strip of cloth, worn but clean, gesturing toward Ethan's hands, and Ethan took it without question, wrapping it around his fingers to keep the cold from biting deeper, the simple act carrying more care than any spoken reassurance could have. No one spoke for a while after that, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding that had formed without being forced, the kind that grows when men share a task without needing to define it. The preacher stirred again, stronger this time, his voice carrying a little more weight as it broke through the quiet. It was not their land to take, he said, each word slow, deliberate, as if it had been held back for too long, and the rider beside Ethan stopped for half a step before continuing. The smallest hesitation that revealed more than any question would have. Ethan glanced at him then, just briefly. Seeing the change in his eyes, the shift from observation to something closer to agreement, and it told him enough, told him that whatever had happened before this night had not been simple, had not been one story told from one side. The group crested the low rise together, and from the top, the land opened up again, stretching out toward where the town would be, still out of sight but closer now. Close enough that Ethan could almost feel it in the air, a difference in the way the wind moved, a hint of something beyond sand and stone. One of the riders behind moved ahead slightly, scanning the path, not searching for danger, but reading the ground the way a man reads a page he has known his whole life. And then he nodded once, signaling a direction that cut slightly to the east, a path that would shorten the distance without forcing them into harder terrain. Ethan followed without hesitation, because at this point, trust was no longer a question he needed to answer. It had already been decided in the miles behind them. The preacher's hand shifted again, this time finding Ethan's sleeve with more purpose, his grip weak but certain, and his eyes opened just enough to meet Ethan's. Something clearer in them now, something that had not been there before, and he spoke again, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to be heard. You chose to carry me. And Ethan held his gaze for a second before nodding once, the motion small but steady, and then he looked forward again, because the path was still in front of them, and the night, though quieter now, was not yet done with them. The night had thinned by the time they reached the second ridge, not lighter, not warmer, but quieter in a way that made every sound carry farther than it should, and Ethan Cole could feel the change not in the air, but in the men around him. The way their steps had slowed just enough to listen, to measure what lay ahead before committing to it. The rider who had taken the lead raised a hand without turning, a small signal that brought the others to a near stop, and Ethan followed without question, easing the preacher's weight down just enough to shift his hold without breaking contact, because setting him fully down now would cost more strength than it would save. The land ahead dipped into a narrow stretch between two low rises, a natural path that cut straight toward the town, but the kind of path that held stories in it, the kind that remembered who passed through and why. And the rider studied it for a long second before moving forward alone, his horse stepping carefully, reading the ground in a way Ethan could not. The others waited, not tense, not uncertain, just patient, and Ethan stood there in the cold, breath slow, eyes fixed on the path ahead, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something heavier than the miles behind them. The preacher stirred again, stronger now, his voice carrying more shape as it rose. They told me to leave, he said, the words uneven but clear, and Ethan did not look down this time, did not ask who, because the answer was already forming in the silence around them. The rider ahead dismounted and crouched, brushing his hand lightly across the sand, not searching, but confirming. And when he stood again, he turned back and gave a single nod, enough to say the path was open, enough to say they could move. They did, not hurried, not careless, but with a purpose that had sharpened without needing to be spoken. And as they entered the narrow stretch, the walls of earth on either side seemed to rise just enough to block the wind, to hold the sound of their steps closer than before. and for a moment it felt like the world had closed in around them, leaving only the path and the choice to follow it. The preacher's hand tightened slightly against Ethan's sleeve, a small strength returning, and his eyes opened again, clearer now, finding the rider walking beside them. And something passed between them in that glance, something that did not need words to be understood. "I spoke for them," the preacher said then, each word steadier than the last, and the rider's jaw shifted just slightly, the only sign that the words had landed where they needed to. Ethan felt it too, not as a story, not yet, but as a weight that explained the silence, the watching, the waiting that had followed them across the desert. The path narrowed further for a few yards, forcing them closer together, forcing them to move as one rather than as separate men sharing a direction, and in that closeness, the lines between them blurred just enough to make the differences matter less than the task they carried. When they emerged on the other side, the land opened again, and this time, far in the distance, just at the edge of what could be seen in the faint light of approaching dawn, there was a shape that did not belong to the desert, a line too straight, too deliberate, the first hint of the town they had been walking toward. Ethan saw it and did not say anything, did not point, because the others had seen it too, and the understanding passed between them without needing to be named. The rider who had walked beside him since the night began slowed just enough to match Ethan's pace exactly, then reached out and adjusted his grip on the preacher, taking a little more of the weight without asking, without waiting, and Ethan let him, because at this point, the burden was no longer something he needed to prove he could carry alone. The preacher's voice came once more, quieter now but certain. "They will hear the truth," and Ethan nodded. Once, not because he knew what that truth was, but because he had carried it this far, and that was enough for now. Behind them, the desert stretched empty again, their path already fading into nothing, and ahead, the town waited, unaware of the story moving toward it, unaware of the choices that had been made in the dark to bring it this far. And as the first faint light of dawn began to touch the horizon, the sound of something distant, something metallic and low, seemed to rise on the wind. Too far to be clear, but close enough to be felt, like a promise that had already begun before any of them had reached its door. The sound grew clearer as they moved, not loud, not urgent, but steady, like something that had already begun without waiting for them. And Ethan Cole felt it before he fully heard it, a low, distant toll carried across the morning air, faint enough to question, strong enough to follow. And as the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, turning the desert from shadow to pale gold, the shape of the town came into view. Roofs and fences and a single steeple rising above it all, still, far but no longer unreachable. The riders slowed slightly, not from hesitation, but from something quieter, something that felt like a boundary being approached, and the man beside Ethan shifted his grip again, easing more of the preacher's weight as the ground began to slope gently downward toward the outskirts. The preacher's breathing had steadied further, each breath deeper than the last, and his eyes opened once more, clearer now, finding the light ahead, and for a moment there was something like recognition in them, not of the place, but of the sound that carried through it. "They are ringing early," he said, voice still weak but certain, and Ethan did not answer, because he had heard it too, had felt it long before the words gave it shape. The path widened as they left the narrow stretch behind, the land opening into a long, gradual descent that led straight toward the town, and with every step, the sound of the bells grew stronger, not chaotic, not panicked, but deliberate, each toll spaced just enough to carry meaning, though what that meaning was had not yet been revealed. The riders exchanged a glance then, brief but clear, and the one who had walked beside Ethan since the night began slowed to a stop, his hand lifting slightly in a signal that needed no explanation, and the others halted with him, their horses quiet, their posture unchanged but their presence shifting back, away from the path that led directly to the town. Ethan took another step before realizing they had stopped, and he turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to see them, to understand what they were choosing without needing it spoken. The man beside him released his hold on the preacher, slowly, carefully, returning the weight fully to Ethan's shoulders, not as a withdrawal, but as a completion, and for a second their eyes met, the kind of look that carries more than words ever could, a recognition of what had been shared, and what would not be carried further. No one spoke, not one of them, because there was nothing left to say that would not lessen what had already been understood. Ethan adjusted his stance, feeling the full weight return, heavier now than it had been moments before, but different, no longer something he was struggling against, but something he was finishing. He nodded once, a small, steady motion, and the rider returned it just as quietly. And then Ethan turned forward again and continued down the slope alone. Behind him, the riders did not follow, did not call out. They simply watched for a moment longer, and then, one by one, they turned their horses and moved back toward the ridges, their figures fading into the land the same way they had first appeared, leaving no mark, no claim, only the memory of their presence, carried in the space between what had been and what would be. The bells rang louder now, clear and undeniable, echoing through the still morning air, and as Ethan drew closer to the town, he could see movement ahead, figures beginning to gather near the church, drawn by the sound before they understood its reason, and the steeple stood tall against the light, the source of the toll that had begun before he had reached its edge. The preacher stirred again, his hand tightening faintly against Ethan's shoulder, and his voice came once more, softer now, but filled with something that had not been there before. "They will see," he said, and Ethan did not look down, did not answer, because whatever they would see was no longer his to explain. The ground beneath his boots changed as he reached the edge of town, from loose sand to packed dirt, from silence to the distant murmur of waking voices. And still the bells continued, steady, unwavering, as if marking not the beginning of something, but the arrival of something that had already been set in motion long before anyone here had noticed. Ethan took another step, then another, carrying the man through the threshold where the desert ended and the town began, the sound of the bells filling the space around him, and for the first time since he had lifted the preacher from the ground, the journey behind him and the moment ahead stood side by side, connected by nothing more than the choice he had made to keep walking when he could have stopped. By the time Ethan Cole stepped fully into the town, the bells were no longer distant. They were everywhere, rolling through the streets, bouncing off wooden walls and glass windows, pulling people from doorways and porches, drawing them toward the church with a quiet urgency that did not need to be explained. And as they turned and saw him, a lone figure walking in from the desert with a man slung across his shoulders, their movement slowed, then stopped, the sound of boots against dirt fading beneath the steady toll that filled the air. No one rushed him, no one called out, because something about the way he walked, steady despite the weight, deliberate despite the exhaustion, told them this was not a moment to interrupt. The preacher's coat hung loose now, dusted with sand, his head resting against Ethan's shoulder, and as they reached the steps of the church, Ethan paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but because the journey had ended without warning, and for a moment, there was nothing left to carry except what came next. A man stepped forward from the gathered crowd, older, his hands worn from years of work, and his eyes moved from Ethan to the preacher, recognition striking before words could form, and he climbed the steps quickly, reaching out not to take, but to steady, to confirm what he was seeing was real. "Father Hale," he said, the name carrying through the silence between the bells, and a murmur moved through the crowd, quiet but growing, the kind that spreads when something long feared begins to shift. Ethan lowered himself carefully, easing the preacher down onto the wooden steps, not letting him fall, not letting the ground take him harder than it needed to, and as he did, the strength in his legs gave just enough to bring him to one knee, his breath catching, his body finally claiming what it had been owed for miles. Hands reached then, more than one, lifting the preacher gently, carrying him through the open doors of the church, the space inside already lit by morning light, and still the bells continued, each toll marking a moment that no one had yet put into words. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, head bowed slightly, not in prayer, not in relief, but in something quieter, something that did not need a name. And then he pushed himself up, slow but certain, and stepped back from the doorway. The crowd parted without being asked, creating space around him, their eyes following, not with suspicion, not anymore, but with something else, something closer to understanding, though none of them yet knew the full shape of it. Inside, voices moved, low and urgent, water being called for, cloth, space. But outside, no one spoke, because the sound of the bells had taken that place, had filled it with something that made words feel smaller than they should be. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to look back the way he had come, toward the open stretch of land beyond the edge of town, and for a moment, there was nothing there, no movement, no sign of the riders who had walked beside him through the night, only the empty desert catching the first full light of day. But he knew they had been there, knew what had been shared in that silence, and he gave the smallest nod toward the horizon, a gesture no one else would understand, before turning back. A figure appeared in the doorway then, one of the men who had carried the preacher inside, his expression different now, steadier, and he looked at Ethan for a long second before speaking. "He is breathing stronger," he said, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything else that morning, and Ethan nodded once, not asking for more, not needing it. The bells began to slow then, their rhythm stretching, each toll spaced further apart, as if the moment they had been marking was coming to a close, and with it, the tension that had held the town in place began to ease, replaced by something quieter, something that would take longer to fully understand. Ethan stepped back once more, away from the church, away from the gathering crowd. His work finished without announcement, without claim, and as he did, the first real silence of the morning settled in behind the fading sound of the bells, leaving only the memory of what had passed through it, and the quiet realization that sometimes the weight a man carries is not measured by who sees it, but by who is still breathing when he finally sets it down.